Good morning. My name is Stephen Keck. I am professor of history at Emirates Diplomatic Academy, and I'm here this morning to discuss my paper, Addressing Southeast Asian Leadership, Diplomatic Narratives, and the Ordering of Colonial Knowledge. And since the paper is rather long, I will just show the slides and talk a little bit about it along the way. And if there is time, I will try to read a little bit of the conclusion, okay? So hope everybody's prepared to listen. Very interested in talking about leadership in history. And in this case, we're looking at early modern diplomatic narratives because they are important for understanding cultural encounters. And so we're going to be looking at the ones, British narratives from about 1775 to about 1825 as they relate to Southeast Asia, in particular, those involving Java and Sumatra. And so many of you will be familiar with some of the figures here, Raffles and Marsden, and I'm also going to look at a couple of minor figures who to understand how they wrote about leadership in these narratives. And the importance of focusing on leadership for historical study, I want to comment on that for just a minute and to say that leadership is something that is a word you hear all the time, and yet it's often kind of elusive. What does it actually mean? But one of the things we're looking at is how leadership is a value add. How does a given leader add value to a circumstance? And leadership is culturally shaped. So when we look at how cultures expect their leaders to behave, how they evaluate them, how they make role models out of them, we actually have a very good lens into cultural encounters. And leadership often involves memory, because when we look at leadership, we often talk about it in terms of lessons learned, things that a great leader or a group of leaders have done exist therefore as lessons for the next generation. And so precisely because leadership is not always easy to quantify, it is a subject that is often very much connected to remembering and making sense out of our past. Now, when we talk about these diplomatic narratives from, say, the world of Southeast Asia, say between 1775 and 1820, many of them are constructed with what I have chosen to call a post-war gaze. And some of you, if not all of you, will be familiar with the term tourist gaze. The post-war gaze is different because what it does is situates the writer of a memoir in time and space, usually after a war, after a diplomatic encounter, but in a situation in which, in many cases, a local power may have been defeated by colonizing power. And so the diplomats come out, and the reason these make good cultural documents is that they're writing everything down, and they will run across informants, people that will want to tell them their side of the place they live in. These are people that might never say a word about it if their regime that they lived under had not fallen. Now that they have been conquered, they want to make friends with the conquerors, and they will speak and they will give intimate details often about the people that used to hold power. And so the post-war gaze is one that sometimes is immediate. It is written with a lot of experience, but it is also sometimes overly biased. And there's another side as well, which is that the post-war gaze means that you will maybe see refugees, you'll see destruction, and you will see the country in maybe its worst possible shape. So if you are writing about Java or writing about Sumatra, and you are doing it from this point of view, your writing may not be representative, or your characterization may not be representative for the way the places actually are most of the time. So I've got three examples. And the first is from a man named John Joseph Stockdale. I made the book, but if you haven't, I'd be surprised if you have heard of him. And in fact, he never actually visited Java. What he did was string together two earlier works in the 18th century about Java, and made them into a publication. And he did it because the British were assembling an invasion fleet in 1811 to go to Java, and therefore this man, a London bookseller, saw the opportunity to basically make some money and to put together a guide to Java so that the British public could read and understand. And Stockdale himself was a man of maybe dubious moral reputation. He later published the memoirs of a woman named Harriet Wilson, who was a courtesan and had many boyfriends, shall I say, and scandalized polite British society, hence this cartoon. But this man was not a scholar, but what he was an opportunist. And so he produced this text, The Island of Java, and it, in a sense, is representative of the idea of providing someone with a guide. So now he did not live long enough to know that by the end of the 19th century, guidebooks would be common because there'd be so many tourists once mass tourism takes hold, and everybody wanted a guide to Java or to Sumatra or Singapore. And so the idea of giving them information will shape their perception is actually becomes common for tourists, and that in essence is what he was doing. And here you see him then building on earlier stereotypes of Java that include Oriental despotism. But I call this the guidebook tradition. Okay, and so when he wrote about leadership here, he talked about how poor Java's people were because they suffered under despots. Okay, the second example is from William Thorn, who was a soldier who was actually wounded in the conflict, that is in the invasion. And this is his narration of something he experienced. And so this is kind of a very much a post-war book. It is one that he, was very proud of British performance. He had added as many documents as he could find. And for our purposes this morning, he also showed how British made their leadership decisions. And that is to say that he would, talk about the risks, the challenges they faced, and why they did what they did on the battlefield. And so he also portrayed British leadership before and after the battle, the importance of memory for morale, so that his, list of some of the soldiers who died. And he also then characterized local leadership. And the case of the removal of Sultan Mahmud Badruddin II in 1812, who had been accused of the most blackest crimes against European living and working in the Dutch factory, as well as against non-Europeans. The British had been called to go to Palembang, where this factory was. So they go to Sumatra. Sultan Badruddin II is removed, and the account provided by Thorn is not so much that it is biased, which it is, but it does not in any way sort of attribute any real leadership skills to Badruddin and some of the other leaders. So there was an inability here to understand both Javan leadership, but also that in Sumatra as well. But what I want everybody to realize, this is also a memoir tradition where a person has direct experience and they may supplement with lots of information. And in fact, Thorn also has, part of it functions as a guidebook as well. Maybe his publisher told him to do so. But this is a memoir And it's also a powerful way to engage a culture because it suggests that you have direct experience. And of course, the sultans are represented as rapacious, lying, cruel, irrational, and so all the stereotypes persist. And the third example is Sir Stamford Raffles. And Raffles is famous. I almost don't need to introduce him here, but simply to say that when he writes the history of Java, he does so drawing on both traditions, both as a guide, because he lays this out as, you get a very big description of Java, but also a memoir of his experiences governing, his experience of trying to reform. He has, in essence, a double post-war point of view because he is deeply familiar with the decline of the VOC in the late 18th century and of the civil strife on the island in the mid 18th century, as well as the collapse of Dutch power, its replacement by the French because of the Napoleonic Wars, and then the British defeating the French and defeating some of the local chieftains in 1812 at Yogyakarta. So he also wrote about cultural difference. He was very much impressed, maybe I should say negatively, about the difference between the ruler and the ruled, thinking that it was beyond anything that he could imagine. So, for example, he writes, an individual, whatever his condition, can stand in the presence of a superior. Neither can he address him in the same language which he has spoken. Not even the heir apparent and the members of the royal family can stand in the presence of the sovereign. The same restriction applies of each subordinate chief. Were this mark of respect confined to the royal family alone, it might find some parallel in other Eastern countries, where it is usual for the subject to prostrate himself before the sovereign. But in Java, the nature of government is such that each delegated authority exacts the same marks of obseisance. And he continues, very much emblematic of a British diplomat, saying that Raffles highlighted this humiliating posture called the dodak. That is to say, the sort of having to squat. And Raffles noted that the subjects did this cheerfully. Raffles, nonetheless, was a real reformer. He wrote and acted as if he could try to improve the status of the Javanese people, despite their leadership. So what Raffles tells us about of cultural encounters is significant. On the one hand, he's very critical of European governments, particularly the Dutch. At the same time, his understanding of leadership was such that he could not see that the local rulers were capable of it because of the distance between the rulers and the ruled. And so ultimately we come down to the point of the paper, in a sense, is that colonial knowledge is dependent on studying things like leadership and memory. Studying leadership often depends upon memory for the lessons learned. Memory also challenges the conventions of colonial knowledge. And so here we have a picture of Sultan Mahmud Badarudin II, the same one that's accused of the blackest crimes, is now regarded as a national hero in Indonesia, local hero in Sumatra as well. And below is the Sultan Mahmud Badarudin II Museum. So what we have here is a very different understanding of leadership, a very different understanding of how the histories in the region goes, very culturally shaped ideas about what constitutes leadership. And so when we add it all up, find that studying leadership is a very interesting subject because it enables us to see several things. So let me just wrap up by saying it this way, that I'll read the very last part of my paper. There should be just time to do that. Now, it might be objected that some of these writers were not well known, with the exception of Raffles, but understanding the leadership dynamics, including the ways in which the British engaged the sultans and the other leaders of the Malay archipelago, go a long way to helping us understand the development of colonial rule in the region. And the same might be said for their engagement with Chinese communities, which interested all of these authors. More important, perhaps, the problematic relationship which the British subsequently developed with many local leaders, could better illuminate the challenges faced by newly independent Southeast Asian nations in the second half of the 20th century. After all, those who ventured to visit Mahmud Baruddin II Museum in Palembang, particularly if they had read Thorn's The Conquest of Java, would surely understand that leadership can make a decisive impact upon human affairs in so many ways. In fact, the emergence of modern Southeast Asia illustrates that those who led the region away from colonialism did so by developing modes of leadership which were underestimated, often profoundly, by many who were able to act and write the dramatic memoirs much later. Either way, the more we consider the study of leadership as a maker of history and as an indicator of cultural encounters, the greater understanding will be of both, and possibly all that lies in between. Thank you very much.